right, so like Greg said, we are obviously Upper Mohawk Valley UN Association. Where this came from is Greg and I have kind of been trying to look through a lot of the sustainable development goals that the UN is really kind of implementing as things that they are wanting to focus on that are tangible things that you can measure, increase like growth in making things better. So things like poverty, education, clean water and sanitation, and a lot more. This can be found on the UN's website if you're curious about more of a breakdown of different things. Today we're going to talk about clean water and sanitation because today is World Water Day. You can find out more information about this with unwater.org. There's a lot going on. You can also look at worldwaterday.org. Tons of stuff going on. Slight background of why Greg chose me to do this talk is I've spent the last 5 years documenting various clean water efforts throughout West and Central Africa. I've done stuff everywhere from the desert into the jungle and rainforest. So I've seen all of the different schemes of how people are able to protect water sources that are able to provide clean water to very remote parts of the world. And when I say very remote, I'm talking get dropped off by a plane on a grass runway by like little teeny Cessna that's like probably the size of like that clump of chairs. So very, very end of the world stuff. Currently at this point in time, over 2 billion people do not have access to clean drinking water. That is a little under a third of the world's population. And when you think about it in this day and age, that's kind of crazy. Also, 80% of wastewater ends up back in rivers and oceans. And that's because, quite frankly, people don't know. So they'll end up doing like their laundry and dishes with a lot of feces and stuff like that upriver from where someone else is drinking of it. Not very, very helpful for trying to help improve the ability for people to live. Also, 1.9 billion people live where water is threatened. Greg and I were recently talking about issues in South Africa where I think it's July 15th, they will actually be shutting off water in South Africa because they do not have enough clean water. The reservoirs are at 25% capacity right now, and they're looking at going down to about 15% shortly, which is crazy to think about because they are a more developed country for the African continent. Why should we support them, and what is the UN doing? Well, the UN, when it comes to water, has 3 main things they do: policy, awareness, and partnerships. So they are working to create policies of how to take care of the issue, and then they're finding partners to go out and do it and helping their partners build the awareness of what to do. In this, there are 8 targets for clean water. As you can see on the graph, there's 8 different little dots or logos, graphics, whatever you want to call it. The first 2 are the top 2 that everyone talks about: achieving universal and equitable access to safe, affordable drinking water for all. These targets are on unwater.org if you want to see more about them. Also, by 2030, they want to provide equitable sanitation and hygiene for all and open defecation locations. I'm going to give you guys a couple examples of that from my own experience. These are protected water sources in Burkina Faso that I was able to document while working on a project. As you can see, that these are changing lives. This is one of the most impactful photos in my life because I actually had just taught those women how to use a faucet. They were 19 and 20 years old and had never used a faucet before. I've said that about 30 times, and I've never seen someone say when they could remember the exact moment they learned how to use a faucet. And then we're going to go to the opposite end of the spectrum. That is a toilet. So this little slit right here is where you got to take care of business. And that was taken last year in a remote village in DR Congo. That was the only thing that they had, and it literally was just a dug pit right below it. So that's what we're trying to get away from and go to much more protected sources. I only took that photo because it was so bad. I don't have a photo of what it should be, just because it's not something you really want to take a photo of. Other targets: improving water quality by reducing pollution and eliminating dumping. You get a lot of issues around gold mining and stuff like that in remote areas of the world. You see a lot of that in like Suriname and DR Congo, where you have a lot of conflict diamonds and conflict gold. And so there's a lot of the waste that from the mining process going back in and other things like that. You also have water efficiency. One of the things that I noticed, I was recently on vacation in Hawaii, it's whenever you're watering plants in Hawaii, it has to be done by wastewater. There's no use of like regular water, it has to be done with wastewater on all the islands. Also pertaining to what Greg said earlier about plastics, Hawaii has banned single-use plastic across the state. So things like that are really kind of starting to make a motion. Also integrating water source and resource management at all levels, trying to figure out ways to be more efficient, again, figuring out ways to pool resources, towns, cities, and stuff like that. Protecting wetlands, forests, and mountains. I was earlier today looking at stuff about UN Water Day, or World Water Day, and there was a guy talking about down on Long Island that there's algae that's taking over a lot of wetlands, and they're trying to figure out how they can try and reduce it without introducing pesticides that will kill certain things that are good to the area. So it's really interesting seeing how the research is being done to preserve the natural habitats of different areas by invasive species that are not necessarily bad in their own space, but they're bad of where they are at certain times. Also, cooperation between countries, that's obvious because you can't do anything alone. And then support and strengthen participation of local communities. That's huge because if one person doesn't care, it's going to ruin it for everyone. And I've seen that in many rural villages personally, where it just can go downhill very, very fast. So that's just a quick read through of like what the UN's doing about clean water and what they're trying to do and trying to achieve. Yeah, so that's about it. Who's introducing?
Sherry, right.
Sherry's got it?
Thank you.
Greg didn't give me that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, it's my privilege. I haven't even had a chance to shake his hand and say hello. But Dr. Stephen Orvis is here to us from Hamilton College. Wrote down a few things. He has spoken to us before. We're very fortunate because he's willing. But he's very good and knowledgeable. In 2015, he spoke to us about the U.S. policy toward Africa. And tonight he just came back from East Africa. His main area of study is in Kenya. He's written articles that appear in African Studies Review, Africa Today, Studies in Comparative International Development, and Journal of Asian and African Studies. So those are, where he's written articles. There's more because I have a whole list printed, but I won't go through them all. I would think probably your biggest achievement, maybe not the biggest, but you published a textbook. And this is important because this goes to universities, on introducing comparative politics, concepts, and cases in context. Together with Carol Ann Drogus in 2011. He also wrote a book himself, personally, The Agrarian Question in Kenya. Having been to Kenya myself, I was very impressed with their I'm not using the right word. They had the integrating of plants in the same field. People didn't have big farms like we have here where they do a whole field of corn or something. But they would plant the corn and they'd have other plants like beans or plants that would grow at their base. So they had this intercropping. I'm trying to think of the correct word. But very important what people are doing there. Dr. Orvis has led Hamilton students, because he's from there, to Kenya, and he visits Africa regularly, but I think he went in 2000 with students. Did you go them every year until 2000?
No, a couple of times, just a couple of times.
Yeah, it said 2000 and 2004. Right, and this month he went, so I don't know what he did this time. That could be something he could tell us. But I was hoping, because he was in Africa, so much of our news of what's going on over there does not come through our media at these times. And maybe you get some on a specific channel, but on the regular channels, there is practically nothing coming out, and I was hopeful he'd learn more about what's going on in South Africa to speak to us tonight. So, without further ado, I'll welcome Dr. Stephen Orvis. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation. I always enjoyed coming here and talking every few years, so I appreciate it. Couple brief stories related to the previous presentation about water and plastic. I mean, just to add a little bit, this wasn't part of the main presentation. It occurred to me as we were speaking about water, but you mentioned the water crisis in Cape Town in particular. And it was supposed to be D-Day, as they're calling it, or Day Zero, I think it's called. It was supposed to be in mid-April, but now they've pushed it back to July because there's been some rain. But it's simply severe drought in a fairly dry area, and they've geared up, from what I've read, quite extensively in all kinds of emergency plans on how they're going to ration water and allocate water and things. But essentially, this is a city of, I don't know, I wasn't prepared to talk about this, so I didn't look it up, but it's not a huge city, but a significant city. I would guess 2 or 3 million people that is literally running out of water. Then Sao Paulo, Brazil, where I spent a lot of time also, was facing the same thing a few years ago. Unfortunately, they were saved by rain, and that's a city of close to 20 million people, much bigger than Cape Town. But Cape Town's a good-sized city. I've been there. So yeah, water is a growing issue, particularly climate change and more extreme everything. Right, it's an area that suffers droughts and is fairly dry anyway, and of course they're getting more extreme, like things like that are everywhere. And then on plastics, I was just, as Sherry said, in Kenya and Uganda for a couple of weeks. And very brief visits, but I hadn't been back in quite a while actually, so it was nice to get there. And one of the things I read about, and Kenya is a country, I spent a lot of time in Kenya, and Kenya is a country that's very poor, much poorer than South Africa, and very corrupt, much more corrupt than South Africa, in fact, by standard measures. So you never know when you read about Parliament passed a law, blah-de-blah, and the first question always in the back of your mind, well, I wonder if that's actually going to happen or not. It's totally hit or miss. So a little story that I was just floored by. A little over a year ago, Kenya followed the lead of Rwanda in the region, and had already done this, of banning plastic bags, the kind you get from the grocery store. They were ubiquitous everywhere. People bought them got them from the grocery store and other stores like we do, and used them everywhere, and trash, on the ground, on the trash, all over, just everywhere. And they're still around. You see them beside the road blowing in the wind and whatever else. But I just spent 2 weeks there, and I did not see one person with one plastic bag. It totally eliminated in just a year. You see, yeah, and they sell these little, really lightweight cloth bags of all sizes in markets, in stores, but also in the open air markets where people are trading their fruits and vegetables. There's a stall with a woman there selling these little plastic bags for 5 cents, 25 cents, 50 cents for the biggest ones. They come in, not plastic, but these little reusable cloth bags. And I'm told tear, they don't last forever, but people buy them and use them multiple times and then get rid of them. And I hope they look like they're probably biodegradable, certainly more so than plastic. I don't know exactly how they're made. I didn't find that out. But they were everywhere. In fact, I took a gift. I knew about this ban, but I just didn't think about it. I took a couple of gifts for a friend and his family, over there, and I stuck them in a plastic bag and stuck it in my suitcase, and got there, and just over a week ago, and saw him, and I brought you these things from the States, and I handed him this plastic bag. He was very appreciative of it, and then immediately said, I have to find something else to put these in. I cannot walk out. He said, if I walk out of here, if a cop sees me, fines are huge. He was like, immediately, we gotta lose this plastic bag, and now. I was like, oh, sorry. So it was, and this is a country where laws are broken all the time in all sorts of ways. There's all kinds of ways around everything. But this is something that apparently the government decided it wanted to do, and it's done, which shows that with a tenth of our resources at best, it can be done if you want to do it. I guess Hawaii has as well. So, but back to South Africa's fragile democracy, which certainly water shortage won't help. I thought what I'd talk about tonight is first kind of setting, the readings you guys have in these books are all, I'm always impressed with. That was a great overview of things. It's a little outdated now, as probably most of you know. The president's changed hands in the last 2 months. And so I'll talk a little about that. But first I thought I'd set it a little more of a general context. I'm not repeating what's in the reading, but because I think understanding pretty much everything that's gone on in South Africa since the end of apartheid requires understanding the basic structure of the situation at the end of apartheid and the negotiations for the new democracy. It was, and also to remind ourselves, I was talking to someone ahead of time and mentioned this, to remind ourselves, I mean, South Africa certainly has problems, but in the long run of things, I still think it's in many ways a pretty amazing success story. It was a classic case in political science of a successful transition to democracy. For anyone even not African, we just talk about what are the classic examples to look at of how transition to democracy happens. South Africa is always one of them. And it worked because of a very clear structure of the situation. At the end of apartheid, there were several things were really clearly well known that helped facilitate the transition to democracy, but also set up the problems that the country, I think, is continuing to face. And those things were, first of all, you had an overwhelming black majority, 85% of the population, probably more like 90 now. And any kind of democracy, if you're going to have anything, no matter what system you put in place in elections and parliamentary, presidential, all the details, any democracy was going to produce a black majority rule. There's just no way that was not going to happen, right? And everyone knew that. And on the other side, once the ANC, and the reading mentioned this in passing, the ANC had always declared itself a socialist organization back in the 50s. They wrote this manifesto that said they were going to nationalize industry and mining and your socialist economy, which not unusual in what we used to call the third world in the 50s and 60s, pretty typical of the time. And that was still in place until the early 90s. But the ANC under Mandela very quickly just tossed that aside, basically recognized that that's not the way the world works in the 1990s and that they were going to be part of the global economy, et cetera. They weren't going to go about nationalizing industry in India, et cetera, for better or worse. But they quickly decided that, and once that decision was made, then the other structural factor was in place. You were going to have black majority rule, but at least for the short to medium term, the economy was still going to be controlled by the whites because they control all the wealth in the country. And as long as you're keeping a private market economy, not taking it over somehow by the state, you were going to have white economic wealth. So the negotiations were about between black political power and white economic wealth and how you were going to try and create. So the process of negotiation, the reading talked about it a little bit, that as anything, it was somewhat difficult, but nonetheless ultimately quite successful, creating a constitution, a new dispensation, Mandela and ANC's election in April of '94, that essentially preserved property rights and therefore white wealth, and also provided some sort of minority protection, primarily aimed at the whites, via federalism first and foremost, and initially there was a transitional government for a few years before the Constitution was finalized. But the fact that everyone knew ahead of time, a lot of transitions to democracy, new political parties, they're trying to create a new constitution, a new electoral system, and it's not clear who's going to come out ahead, and there's a lot of risk and uncertainty for political actors, so it's not clear what they're going to agree to. The interesting about South Africa is the results were very clear. Blacks are going to rule, black majority is going to rule, and in the short term, ANC is going to win, and Mandela's going to be president. Everyone knew that. There was no question about that ahead of time. But whites had economic power, and that had to be dealt with if you're going to have a country that's going to hold together. So that was, the great success of creating the initial constitution. People are elected, and you've had a functioning democracy ever since. Fragile, yes, at times, but functioning. But that same structure created political and economic dynamics that are still playing out today. So I'll talk about those a little bit, and then update things to kind of the current situation. Like a lot of nationalist parties, the ANC was to some extent still is, a really exceptional political party. A nationalist party that, and this was true elsewhere in the former colonial world and from the 40s through the 60s, a nationalist party that leads the nation to independence, in this case, liberation from apartheid rather than independence from actual colonial rule, is a different kind of beast from a typical political party. They're not just a political party. They, in a sense, kind of created the nation. They're the salvation of the nation, the liberators of the nation. And the ANC was very much in that mold, right, in the 1990s. And Mandela, of course, was a great hero of the country. And so the ANC quickly becomes a dominant party. It won, it's always, the last national election 4 years ago, it was 2014, they won 62% of the vote. That's their worst showing. It's mostly been closer to 70%, somewhere between there. The first one was like 64, and then moved up to like 68 or 69, and it fell back down to 62 4 years ago. So what's been created is what political scientists call a dominant party democracy. It is a democracy in the sense of basically the rule of law exists, there's freedom of expression, there's not actually, the elections are basically free and fair. Not perfect, but whose are? Ours aren't either. But basically, and they don't have an electoral college, right? They just, party gets 60% of the vote, they get 60% of the seats. It's not that complicated. So they've got this base, so they've basically got a functioning democracy, but the same party keeps winning, all right? The same party's won every election with over 60% of the vote since 1994. Every 5 years there's an election. India once had this kind of system under the Congress Party. It's since fallen apart. Japan under the LDP had it. It kind of fell apart. The LDP's been resurrected. Not clear they have quite the same kind of dominance. So there are other examples of this particular model of a dominant party democracy. It's different from what most political scientists now call an electoral authoritarian regime like Putin's Russia, where yes, there's elections, but they're sham elections. Putin really controls everything. He might allow a little tiny bit of opposition to do something, but not much. In South Africa, a dominant party system, it's a real democracy. Opposition parties have controlled a provincial government or two. As you already talked about, they just won a couple of 2 years ago, 2016, won a couple of major cities, including the capital. So they control those. So there's real competition. The opposition can compete. It's just that the ANC keeps winning. They're popular. So that creates a certain political dynamic. Two types of politics tend to happen in dominant party systems. One is the most important political battles are usually among factions within the dominant party. The politics between the ANC and the other parties isn't as important as what are the factions and divisions within the ANC and who's controlling it, because they keep winning every election, so who's going on internally there matters most. And the biggest factions in the ANC, originally this is kind of faded, but in the 90s there was a big division between, and this comes back to play with the new president actually now, I'll get to it in a little bit, between the internal and external wings of the movement. When the ANC was forced underground in the late 50s, early 60s, and Mandela went underground and led the Umkhonto weSizwe, the violent military wing of the party, and one of his compadres, Walter Sisulu, led the political arm. They both went underground. Ultimately, they were arrested and went to Robben Island, etc. They sent someone else, and their third closest comrade, a guy named Govan Mbeki, the Thabo Mbeki, the president's father, into exile. They wanted to have an exile and international presence. So he and his family and others from the ANC became an external wing of the ANC that were out of the country from the early 60s to the early 90s. A generation, 30 years. Yes. And so there was, after the end of apartheid, one split was between those who had continued to work internally, especially in the 70s and 80s, younger people on the ground opposing the regime, and the external wing of the party when they came back in the early 90s. So that was one division. Another division that the reading talked about a lot is an ideological division between those who are more pro-business and keeping economic growth going and keeping economic stability versus more of a populist focus on trying to help the black impoverished majority of the country via redistribution, et cetera, et cetera. That's always been a tension, and it still is. It's still probably the primary one. A little bit of, not as much in many African countries, a little bit of ethnic tensions too, but those aren't primary in South Africa. But anyway, the factions within the party are really the main politics in the country, the most important politics in the country. And then that relates to the second question, a second kind of longer-term political dynamic is usually the key question, and I think true in South Africa as well, the key question in a dominant party system is when and how will the dominant party split. The system, it transitions to some other kind of system, hopefully beneficially, when the dominant party splits. And the opposition is usually never able to just overcome it without the party splitting. So there have been various ideas over the years about the ANC is going to split, and little branches of it have split off, but so far the bulk of it has stayed in one piece, and as long as it does, it's probably going to continue to rule. So those are kind of the political dynamics that were set up by the position of the ANC and the transition to democracy after apartheid. So let me talk a little bit now about post-apartheid economic situation, which your reading talks about too. As I said, the crucial structural factor is whites continued control the wealth of the economy after apartheid, the end of apartheid. South Africa is a middle-income country, much wealthier than almost anywhere else on the continent. Apartheid was economically very successful for a very long time. It produced a tremendous amount of economic growth and took what was originally a purely mining economy and created an industrial, semi-industrial powerhouse, regional powerhouse under racist white control, but nonetheless economically quite successful. In fact, that was part of the problem. One reason apartheid fell apart was apartheid was a great system for controlling labor. We can talk about this later if you're interested. Controlling labor in mines, but industrialization requires different kinds of labor, more skill, more educated labor, and apartheid could not provide the labor force for an industrialized economy. So they kind of sowed the seeds of their own destruction, in a sense, by being so economically successful. So the issue ever since the end of apartheid economically has been how blacks are going to be integrated more into the economy and gain greater control over wealth. And on one level, there's been a reasonable amount of success at the top end, and the new president is a classic example of this, in the creation of what's often called a black middle class. So some of them are well beyond middle, black middle and upper class. The now, in terms of just size, is about as big as the white population as a whole. So you have actually a multiracial upper class in the country now. A lot of educated black folks have moved into private, obviously government, but also the private sector at very high levels and very successfully, partly because they're talented people and partly sometimes for political reasons. Corporations wanted to make sure they had especially politically well-connected people from the ANC at their higher reaches. So there's a significant it's called black middle class, and middle class is often a euphemism though. I mean, in the context of the overall side of the economy, these people are not in the middle, they're up here at the top with the whites, but they live what we would see as a middle class or above lifestyle. So that's one element of redistribution of wealth kind of at the top. Other issues that have not been nearly as successful though include land reform. The whites controlled 80+% of the land. They still control something like 78%. There's been very little land reform. Whites still control the vast acreage of farming land around the country, and that's a huge issue in rural areas. And social services have certainly expanded, but not nearly as much as a lot of poor South Africans would like in terms of improvement of access to safe water being one of them, access to electricity, improved housing. Education is probably one of the most successful ones. In all these areas there have been significant improvements, but not nearly enough improvements. So there's this constant tension between those who are now not only white, but of multiple races who control wealth and control businesses vis-a-vis an impoverished majority that is looking for more redistribution of wealth. And the ANC is always, trying to balance between these two. They're governing over the top of everyone. They have this long liberationist, nationalist, what should I say, kind of narrative of we're the salvation, the liberators of the country, but they also are very interested in keeping a robust economy going and being friendly to business, both domestically and internationally. So there's a constant tension back and forth. And the shift away from mining has continued. And throughout the share of mining in the economy, still crucial for exports, but it's been cut in about half in the last 20, 30 years. It was about 15% of the economy, now it's down to under 10%, like 8 or 9%. So you think of South Africa, you think of mines, and it's a huge mining economy, but it's still, at this point, a relatively small part of the total. So that's the economic dynamics, and the political dynamics set up by apartheid as a whole. So where are things now? Let me add a few things that your reading talked a little bit about the economic situation. I'll talk a little bit more about that, and then I'll talk about some of the current political situation, particularly since this was produced last summer or fall. So current economic context, then, after all of these dynamics were set up by the transition, the political dynamics, this question about redistribution of wealth, the economic dynamics, kind of where has the country been in recent years? It is what officially classified by the World Bank as an upper middle income country, which is far from the poorest place in the world. I looked it up just to see where it compared to give you some examples. And the other countries in per capita income right near it are Colombia, Serbia, Peru, and South Africa slightly below Brazil, noticeably more below Mexico, but way above the poorest countries in the world, much wealthier than Haiti, much wealthier than the vast majority of Africa. The only African countries that are wealthier than South Africa are Equatorial Guinea, which is a little despotic place on the West African coast that has a whole lot of oil and very few people, and one guy owns all the oil, the dictator. So they have a high per capita income, but it's an extreme inequality. It's a really sad situation. And the other one, a much more positive situation, is Botswana, which is actually noticed on your map, is right above, right next to South Africa. One of the unheralded economic and political successes of the world in the last 30 plus years. It's also a country with a whole lot of resources, in this case diamonds, and very few people. So that helps. But it's been compared to many such situations, it's been very well managed. And it's a dominant party democracy also, but one that's been a continuous democracy since the 1960s. So anyway, those are the only two countries in Africa that are wealthier than South Africa, and South Africa is much bigger than either of them. So in terms of overall economic weight, South Africa is the premier economy on the continent. There's absolutely no question about that. And it's very important. And when it first gained independence, apartheid ended, there was a great hope that South Africa would kind of lead the continent in the way Japan, then Korea, now China is leading Asia and creating regional growth. And that has not happened nearly as much as people had originally hoped. But it's nonetheless, there's certainly a lot of poor people in South Africa, there's extreme inequality. But for someone who spent a lot of time in a poor country like Kenya, I've only been to South Africa once about 10 years ago, and you're struck by the wealth. South Africa, just walking in the door in South Africa, I spent a lot of time in Brazil also, and South Africa looks a lot more like Brazil than it does like Kenya, even though the people are black Africans in South Africa and Kenya, but in every other conceivable way, it looks much more like its fellow middle-income country, Brazil, than it does in terms of the infrastructure and what people are doing. I spent a part of a day in a shanty town, one of the former townships. I was with some other Americans who hadn't been any place like that before, and they were astounded by the poverty. And I was astounded, having spent time in similar places in Nairobi, by the lack of poverty. Not that there wasn't poverty, but I immediately looked around. The first thing I noticed is the kids have minimally decent clothing on and they're not malnourished. which they are in the shanty towns of Nairobi. I mean, they're poor. These people are poor, but they didn't have kwashiorkor, and I can tell that at a glance. And that's good, you know, that's good. Wealth matters, even in a situation of inequality. So a little bit about, so that's kind of the overall context. It's been a middle-income country and remains that. In terms of like overall economic well-being and growth in recent years, the first decade of this century was actually a very good decade for most of Africa prior to the Great Recession. There was a boom of commodity prices, oil and minerals and agricultural products, and that helped a lot of African countries, including South Africa. And you may recall the BRICS. Everyone's forgotten about the BRICS. They've gone out of, but 10 years ago, everyone was talking about the BRICS, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, right? And these were the up-and-coming, middle-income, industrializing countries that were both before and for a while, for the first 2 or 3 years after the Great Recession, till about 2012 or so, were growing very rapidly. After that, and if you remember this, after the Great Recession, a whole lot of investment capital after the collapse here fled to those countries. Their currencies boosted, their stock markets went through the ceiling, and so they're the new future of the global economy. Now, unfortunately, most of it was fueled by commodity, or a lot of it was fueled by commodity prices. Obviously, China's kind of in a category by itself, but certainly in South Africa and Brazil, it was fueled mainly by commodity prices, which have since come way down, and both those countries are hurting now. So growth was really good. If you look at, I was looking back at some data, till about 2012, there's very strong growth. In the last 5 years have been much weaker. In the last couple of years, practically zero, and given population growth, that means negative in per capita terms. People on average are getting poorer the last few years. So the economy is not nearly as good as it was. And of course, poverty and inequality are huge problems. I just throw out some data to give you a sense of that. It's improved, but nonetheless, based on the national poverty line, which is relative to the country as a whole, poverty rate stands at 55% now. It was 2/3 10 years ago, so it's come up in the last 2 or 3 years, but come down overall in the last 10 to 15 years, but still horrendously high. Absolute poverty, which is a UN calculated number of the equivalent of $1.90 per day per person. Below that is considered absolute poverty, stands about a quarter of the South African population is in absolute poverty, as opposed to relative poverty at the national poverty level, which is over 50%. And of course, that poverty is overwhelmingly black, right? So the people who are poor there's virtually no white poverty in the country, a little bit of mixed race poverty, but not nearly as much. It's overwhelmingly black, and gotten slightly worse in the face of a stagnant economy. One thing that has helped is South Africa has a robust, and we can talk about this later if you want, kind of the new great promise in development work in the last decade coming out of Latin America are social grants or cash transfer programs. The best book on the subject I know is called Just Give Money to the Poor. It's not that complicated. And that's essentially what cash transfer programs are. Giving money to the poor from the government, sometimes funded from outside sources. They're called social grants in South Africa, and they started out like 15 years ago, and now up to about 30% of the population gets these social grants. They don't remove them from poverty, but they help. They help some. A lot of them are conditional. I don't know the details in South Africa. There's multiple programs there, but a lot of them they're called conditional cash transfers. Mexico and Brazil pioneered this 15 to 20 years ago and been very successful at reducing poverty. The conditional cash transfers usually apply, basically a poor family gets a certain amount of money a month if they do two things. Make sure the kid shows up at school, and make sure the kid shows up once a year at a health clinic to get vaccinated, etc. That's all they have to do, get the kid in there, to make sure they're getting educated and staying minimally healthy, and they get this money every month. So it fights against child labor, taking a kid out of school and putting him in child labor, provides income instead of doing that, and it reduces poverty. In Brazil, it's been quite successful. So that's a program that's expanding, still not adequate, but certainly expanding. Unemployment has been a continuing problem, and figures in the book and standard things bandied about is 25% unemployment rate. that's low. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of underemployment and partial employment all over, again, against primarily black and mixed race. In fact, I was just reading a book by an anthropologist whose work I like very much on Southern Africa and this issue of social grants and the importance of social grants. And he's essentially arguing that South Africa and a lot of other places like that are never going to employ people, all of the population. We have an image that employment is the way to get well-being, right? You get jobs, get an education, get jobs, and welfare kicks in when that's not possible, but there's still, the assumption is that somehow everyone can get a job. And he's arguing that in the context of Southern Africa, primarily South Africa, but Southern Africa more generally, he sees no way, he argues, that's just ridiculous to think that's going to happen. We just need to rethink society entirely. That we're not going, the economy, no matter how robust it gets, is not going to employ all these people, and we need to think differently about how we can support them. And social grants will be part of that. But anyway, employment is a huge problem. So with that level of poverty and employment, of course, inequality is massive. South Africa is certainly one of, the most, depending on exactly how you measure, the most unequal society in the world. The region in general has now kind of replaced Latin America as the most unequal. The standard measure is a thing called the Gini coefficient, and South Africa and several of its neighbors are over 0.6, which is, there's only a handful of countries in the world that it goes from 0 to 1 that are that high. As point of comparison, as we all know, the U.S. has become significantly more unequal over the last generation in the U.S. We're at somewhere around 0.43, 0.45, and South Africa is at like 0.62. The lowest, the best, the most equal anyway, Finland, Norway, Scandinavia, generally Japan are down like 0.21, 0.22, 0.23 to give you the range. So the inequality is, there's been the white and black upper class, but the continuing poverty and unemployment, so the inequality is massive. You can also see that in residential system. Apartheid was a massive system of residential segregation, very conscious, very carefully planned, with huge spaces in between, the white enclave over here and the black township, not just next door, but 5 or 10 miles away. And that's the labor reserve that comes to serve our needs and keep it out there. A lot of that, the greatest residential segregation is actually among this middle and upper class. Where you do go into the middle and upper class neighborhoods, you will see mixed race folks, because there are black folks who can afford to live there now. But the townships are still very much there. They have some extent better housing, electricity, water, etc. They used to have, certainly. But they nonetheless are still, the residential segregation is still entirely visible. So the inequality and poverty and unemployment are still, massive problems, and that's what fuels kind of the political dynamics by redistribution. But I wanted to talk briefly too about some things. There are improvements. The social services have really, I think people trash the ANC government more than it deserves sometimes. It's far from perfect, but it's done some things. Secondary education has improved dramatically, which is true all over the continent. Secondary enrollment is nearly universal now. Almost everyone gets a high school education. It was about 2/3 20 years ago, and now it's nearly everyone. Problem, of course, when you expand an educational system that rapidly is the quality and the unequal system. The apartheid system had distinct white, mixed race, and black educational systems that were dramatically different, and whites being dramatically superior. And that's no longer true legally, but nonetheless those legacies last, and you can still see those differences on the ground in terms of where most blacks go to school and where most whites go to school. Not unlike the US, although probably more extreme. And Reedy mentioned there's been a rash of protests in the last several years among university students, over a number of things, partly over symbolic issues, not unlike the US, about monuments and symbols of apartheid that still continue to exist, parallel to our debates about Confederate flags and monuments and things. That's been an issue in the last few years. But also about just the cost and quality of university education. It's too expensive and they're not getting good enough quality. Shut down universities repeatedly. Some of our students who are studying abroad there, Cape Town has become a popular place to study abroad, and some of our students have got caught up in, they're there to study for a semester, and then there's a massive strike and the university shuts down and they don't have any classes, and how are they going to get credits? And my wife works in the study abroad office. This becomes a nightmare for her to deal with. Minor thing, right? More important issues than our rich students getting their credit, but it's become an issue. So much so that people are not going to study abroad there as much. They're afraid to, that they won't be able, they won't finish the semester and get their credit. But nonetheless, overall education improved. Great improvements in healthcare, infant mortality, which is, children dying before they reaching their first birthday, is down from 51 per 1,000 in 2002 to 34. So a drop from 51 to 34. Again, in context, the U.S. number is about 6, and we're not great for a rich country compared to most of Europe, right? There was often 2 or 3 in some European countries, maybe 4. But nonetheless, improvement. Child mortality similarly down, which is under age 5, down from 77 to 44 in the same period. HIV, you remember the huge African HIV crisis? It was primarily a Southern African HIV crisis. The rates of HIV infection in West Africa have never differed much from what they are in the U.S. It's an Eastern, and for particular reasons, an Eastern and first and foremost Southern African crisis. And they were as high as 30% in South Africa. Adult infection rates, they're down to about 19% of the latest figures I could find. The previous government, the reading talked about this under Thabo Mbeki, had this horrific denialist policy, trying to pretend the whole thing was a Western conspiracy and it didn't really exist. Zuma, for all his faults, the one good thing he did anyway was he reversed that immediately. And now, with the presence of ARVs, some changes in drug rules, ARVs are pretty widely available, and South Africa has a robust kind of HIV support movement in the country. And again, it's not perfect, it's far from perfect, but it's way ahead of where it was a decade or more ago. So healthcare has improved, and the basic health outcomes have improved. Percentage of the population with electricity since the end of apartheid was 56%, now it's 86%. People with water in their house. I'm not sure about the safety quality, but water now has gone from 83 to 93% in the same period. And the social grants I mentioned elsewhere, housing has improved too, maybe not as much. So there have been things that have improved. But nonetheless, there's continuing pressure because of the extreme inequality and poverty. Even though there's been noticeable improvements, there's still a great deal, and rightly so, political pressure for more that the ANC is constantly trying to manage, keeping domestic and global business interests happy. And in some cases, such as Zuma, is lining their own pockets along the way, but also in trying to keep the base of their support, which is the poor black majority in the country, feeling like they have some benefit from the system, and they're losing that. It seems that they're losing that support now. So that's the economic context, and I'll close, and then we can open for questions with so what's the current political situation most recently? So probably most of you know that the reading left off with Zuma is increasingly threatened, increasing charges of corruption, losing popularity, etc. And so elections are every 5 years. The president, and they don't really quite explain this, the South Africa system's unusual. It's really more of a parliamentary system, even though the head honcho is called the president. So the voters elect a parliament. They don't elect the president directly. They elect the parliament elects the president. And so the ANC has controlled the parliament throughout, over 60% of the seats. And so the ANC, in effect, the president of the ANC is the president of the country. And they can only serve 2 terms. The elections are every 5 years, every April, like clockwork. The next one will be next April, just a little over a year from now. And so Zuma is in his second term was in his second term, coming towards the end of his second term. And he replaced Mbeki early. The ANC has its own internal party, democracy and conventions, and what he did to Mbeki, a guy named Cyril Ramaphosa just did to him being Zuma. All right? So Zuma came into power before the last election by getting the ANC members at their convention to vote him in as president of the ANC. And therefore, ANC parliamentarians dutifully voted Zuma in as president of the country, and he ran for his first term, having already been put in the position like a year early. Nothing. I mean, it's perfectly legal in the salary system. There's nothing, no chicanery in this. It was just rather than just waiting through the end of his term and then having a competition, he was able to, within the party, unseat the leader and become president, and then lead an election for a full 5-year term successfully. So Zuma did that to Mbeki, and then got reelected in 2014. And then Cyril Ramaphosa came along and just did the same thing in February to Zuma. He convinced the party members, a fair amount of internal democracy, some 1,000 to 1,500 delegates in an annual party convention, and he competed with Zuma's wife, who was his chief rival, and Zuma wanted to appoint his wife as his successor. She was she'd been foreign minister, a major political figure in her own right. The Zuma family lost that battle. A guy named Cyril Ramaphosa was elected as president of the ANC, and then a couple of weeks later, elected by parliament as president of the country. So he presumably will lead the campaign. It's really a parliamentary campaign next April. Assuming the ANC keeps a majority, he will be president of the country for a 5-year term, and he can have a second one. Most people are optimistic about Ramaphosa. Let me tell you a little bit. He's a really interesting guy. I don't know a lot of detail about him. He's I'll go ahead and then I'll tell you about some of what was going on with Zuma. So Ramaphosa has been around as a political activist for many years. He arose in the mine working union. He really became the leader of the mine workers union in the 70s or 80s. I forget when he took leadership. It's the most important union in the country. He was one of the key leaders of an organization called the UDF, the United Democratic Front, which was the kind of internal legal in the 1980s. Many of you here were old enough, as I am, to remember the 1980s. And in South Africa, you remember there was massive street protests, sometimes violent, sometimes peaceful, right? And people trying to make the townships ungovernable, which all led to the whites finally throwing in the towel and releasing Mandela in the transition. Tremendous on the ground, opposition to apartheid growing rapidly in the mid-1980s in particular. Ramaphosa was a key part of that, a key leader of that, as the movement, the UDF, the United Democratic Front, brought together the unions, which he was leader of, students, and grassroots community organizations. And they were all ANC supporters, but the ANC was still banned. You couldn't publicly be ANC, but they were the face of the ANC on the ground. Create a new organization. Sometimes the apartheid regime would ban them, and so they'd create a new one under a new name. They just try to stay ahead of the regime. Ramaphosa was a key part of all that. When Mandela was released, he tapped Ramaphosa to be his chief negotiator. So Ramaphosa was the ANC's day-to-day chief negotiator in the 3-year negotiations it took to produce a new constitution and democracy. He was the guy doing it on a day-to-day basis. And he became a member of parliament, and he wasn't a cabinet minister, but he was a member of parliament, a prominent political leader when Mandela was president in 94 to 99. Mandela only served 1 term and stepped down famously, a la George Washington. I guess George did too. And Mandela made it quite clear he wanted Ramaphosa to be president then. That Ramaphosa was Mandela's choice at the time. But the internal versus external factions of the ANC I talked about earlier kicked in, and Thabo Mbeki, whose father had been sent into exile 30 years earlier, was the leader of the external faction, and they essentially won the battle within the party, and Mbeki was chosen as president. And Mandela, all his life, to his dying breath, was very firm on the collective leadership of the ANC. It was an open secret that he supported Ramaphosa, but the party decided it was Mbeki, so he said, fine, it's Mbeki. I bow to the collective leadership. So Mbeki became president, for better or worse. And Ramaphosa left politics. He decided, and he went into business, and he's certainly one of probably the richest black African in the country. He's worth about $500 million. And a little irony here, the union worker goes into business, sits on the boards of mining companies, among other things. And perhaps not all of it quite legal, but he became kind of the poster child, if you will, of this rising new black elite class in the economy. Was used his political connections, and by all accounts, he's a very sharp, capable guy, to get on boards of all kinds of companies and executive positions here and there, and he bought a lot of land, and he owns a lot of cattle. I don't know what all he owns. But anyway, he's became a fabulously successful businessman. He kept pretty quiet politically, but I'm sure behind the scenes he was always involved in paying attention. There was always talk about him coming back. And he finally did 5 years ago in 2014. He, like a year ahead of time, he started kind of an internal campaign to become deputy president of the country, which is kind of, the heir apparent. So he was chosen, and so he's been deputy president for the last 5 years, but everyone knew, he was deputy president to Zuma, but they weren't friendly at all. He was Zuma's rival. Everyone knew this. Zuma wanted his wife, who had been, I think the most recent position was foreign minister, wanted his wife to replace him and keep the family in charge. And Ramaphosa became his chief opponent as deputy prime minister, or deputy president for the last 5 years. And so this led to this contest just a couple of months ago that Ramaphosa ultimately prevailed. Not by a lot, the vote was quite close, but he won the ANC vote, and now, finally, 20 years later, he's president of the country, and presumably, unless something goes radically wrong, will be elected next year to a full 5-year term. He represents the more kind of moderate, centrist business wing of the party at this point. Zuma has always been kind of the populist figure, though horrifically corrupt. What became clear in the last couple of years, there have always been all kinds of rumors about corruption with Zuma, going way back in the 1990s. But in the last couple of years, what increasingly came out is that he and his family members and closest associates were in bed with a couple of Indian businessmen named the Guptas. They were brothers. And I don't know the details of the scheme, but they basically milked the country and the government for hundreds of millions of dollars, apparently, maybe billions, on a massive level of corruption via false tenders and all. I don't know the details of how they worked it out, all fed it through a particular bank and then mostly out of the country. We don't know all the details of this yet. There was been prosecution for older charges of corruption that when he became president, he was able to clamp down on. So what's happened it's very early days, but most people are fairly optimistic now. Ramaphosa has, first of all, allowed the prosecution to resume on Zuma's corruption charges. The Gupta family fortune is in grave peril. They've lost their connection to the leadership of the ANC, and also the bank. It's an Indian bank that operated in South Africa that was funneling, that they were using to launder all this money, essentially, has now pulled out of the country. And there was I'm not sure why, but there was some court case that was involved to allow them to leave the country. There had to be some legal thing. So that's gone through and been allowed to happen. So when I've read that, basically shatters the Gupta's whole network. They don't have a bank to launder this money through anymore. So their empire is collapsing around them rapidly. I assume they're still in the country. I don't know. There isn't a direct prosecution of that yet. The prosecution that Zuma is facing now is for older charges from prior corruption schemes. But anyway, that's going on, and we can hope that that's a legitimate effort to clean up corruption. You never know for sure. Corruption, when in a corrupt society, corruption is, anti-corruption drive is a really convenient way to get rid of your political rivals. Xi Jinping in China has done a lot of that, right? He's done a lot of anti-corruption work. It's probably a good idea that people he's probably sent in jail are corrupt, but they also happen to be his political rivals, which is convenient. So you never know for sure in this kind of situation. Is Ramaphosa really serious about trying to clamp down on corruption? I certainly hope so. Corruption in South Africa, my impression is, it's not completely endemic the way it is in some places, including Kenya, where I spend a lot of time, where no one you hear about it, and you forget about it when you're not there. When you're back there, you hear about it all the time, every day from people. You can't get a job without paying a bribe. You can't get a driver's license without paying a bribe. You can't do anything unless you have a cousin who really likes you on the inside or you pay a bribe at the lowest local level. And it goes from top to bottom. And that's when it gets that bad, it's really hard to root out. Right? It's the way the whole society works. Everyone hates it, except the people at the top who are making the big bucks. I assume, I don't know any of them, but I'm guessing they like it. Everyone I know at the local level participates in it and hates it. I mean, you have to survive. You want a driver's license, you want to get your kid in school, you want a job, you pay a bribe. South Africa, from what I've read, I haven't spent enough time there to know, but isn't at that level, so the corruption can be unwound before it gets that bad, and hopefully Ramaphosa will do it. I'm guardedly optimistic. He's like a pretty impressive guy, but you don't know for sure. All we know for sure right now is he's letting the prosecution go at his main political rival. So that we don't know enough yet. That's good, but yeah, we'll see what happens going forward. In Kenya, when the new government came in power in 2002, the only time the government changed hands from one party to another via an election, there was a big anti-corruption sweep vis-a-vis the prior regime, and everyone was thrilled with this, and corruption seemed to be cleaning up. But within a year or two, the new government started creating its own corruption scheme, and things went back to status quo ante, unfortunately. So you never know for sure. So Ramaphosa has done that. He's put a cabinet in place that includes a lot of people that at least business interests are happy with and think they'll restore some of the economy. Let's see, I mentioned, he made a big statement, I saw this in the Kenyan papers, again, to Sherry's point, you don't see us here, but in Kenya's papers, a big statement about how we have to do something about land reform, and I believe in even, confiscation of unused land to redistribute. So he's making kind of good noises about that. That's a very difficult issue. We'll see where that goes. In the meantime, the ANC has been losing popularity. Under Zuma. So as I said, it got 62% 4 years ago, which was the lowest it's ever gotten in a national election. In 2016, in the local elections, it only got 52% of the vote nationwide. So it lost, so it dropped from 62 to 52. And the most recent opinion poll I found by Ipsos, which is a well-known French firm that does very good work, showed their popularity. This was last summer, our summer, May or June, something like that. It was the basic question: if the election were now, which party would you vote for? The ANC was 47%. And that was as Zuma's, the reading mentioned Zuma's favorability ratings were 20%, right? And the party was still at 47%. Now, with Zuma gone, my guess is the next poll will show the ANC back up somewhat. I would expect. I think people are mostly happy with that situation. But even with the 47%, the opposition remains divided. The book talked about the Democratic Alliance, the main opposition party, which is a descendant originally of white liberals under apartheid, of folks who opposed apartheid, a small minority who opposed apartheid, but participated in the system in the white-only elections and elected their people to parliament. They never had much power, but they were, a lot of people criticized them for participating at all, but they were honestly anti-racist, anti-apartheid people. So that was the origin of that party, but since then other whites from the former Nationalist Party have joined in, and they've got a multiracial coalition now, but they've controlled provincial governments, but that poll from last summer showed their support at 21%. So ANC is at 47, number 2 is at 21, and then there's a whole bunch of also ran. So the opposition remains, as it always has been, divided into lots of little pieces, which makes it very difficult to defeat the ANC. I think the ANC has done a lot of good things over the years, prior to Zuma, not always good things. I'm maybe more sympathetic to them than some people are, but nonetheless, for any healthy democracy, eventually one party has to lose an election and leave voluntarily and another party take over. That's crucial. But you never, most people would argue, you don't know for sure that you have a stable democracy until that happens successfully. In many countries it didn't happen for a very long time. And it hasn't happened in South Africa yet, so that's still something that has to happen. And Ramaphosa faces the same kind of demands for redistribution. The reading talked a little bit about the Julius Malema, who's an ANC youth leader, originally a Zuma ally, populist, very charismatic guy, younger guy, who eventually broke with Zuma because Zuma didn't pick him to be the deputy president, the heir apparent, and left the ANC and created his own party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, that's polling at like 8%. I mean, he's got support among young, poor blacks in townships, not all, but some. So there's kind of the leftist pressure on the ANC, but there's the opposition. The DA is more pro-business even than the business wing of the ANC, Ramaphosa. So again, the underlying political dynamics haven't changed that much in terms of pressure to redistribute versus pressure to keep business happy, etc. Ramaphosa's been in office for 6 weeks, so it's very early days. So far, things look good. We'll see. So I'll leave it at that, and happy to, hope we have good discussion, questions, whatever. Yeah.
I just wonder whether the Chinese have come into South Africa.
Oh,
They've come into a lot of other countries, take advantage of natural resources. They build roads, they bring their own Chinese labor. They've apparently gotten the right to fish commercially in Lake Victoria, and the locals are complaining that the fish are getting scarce. So are they in South Africa?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what are they doing there?
They're mining, and I don't know what else they're doing. They're probably building a lot of infrastructure. I honestly don't know. I haven't followed that closely, but they are. I forgot about that. I didn't put together a PowerPoint, but a recent graph on exports from South Africa by region and sector, and there's all a bunch of little lines. There's one line that's way up here, with all the other ones are down here. That line that's way up there are mineral exports to Asia. Now, they're not all going to China, but the vast majority of them are. Yes, they are very active all over Southern Africa. Huge in Angola, huge in Zambia, very big in South Africa as well. South Africa is a much bigger pond, so there's other players there as well. But yes, I'm sure they're very involved. So the same thing everywhere, as you said, everywhere in Africa. I was just in Kenya, and I was struck every time I go back by the growing Chinese presence, not just this. A building boom going on in Nairobi, and the biggest building I saw, is big prominent banner of is some Chinese company. The biggest one that's going, a bunch of them are going up. I'm sure they're not all Chinese, but the biggest one is Chinese. And I was just struck by the number of just Chinese people around. It's on provincial and western Ghana, on shores of Lake Victoria, and flying back to Nairobi, and the plane had several Chinese folks on it, going, doing business, doing whatever. Just a presence that 20, 30 years ago you just never saw at all. Yeah. And it's a mixed blessing, undoubtedly. Some good, some bad. They certainly are building a lot of stuff. Kenyans are thrilled. They built, a new railroad. The old railroad was built 120 years ago. It was totally falling apart. They built a new railroad that I wasn't on, but I told us spectacular and works and is smooth and lovely and reasonably costs and all this stuff. But people complain about shoddy workmanship, and this is a huge issue there, and the Chinese are, at this point, most places more important than the U.S. economically, almost all of Africa.
Is there a possibility that Africa may become a new destination for manufacturing jobs, just in the same way as China did back in the early 90s?
Yeah. One can hope. It's a long way in coming. Africa's in a bad position for this kind of thing.
What was the question?
The question was, can Africa, South Africa or anywhere else, become a destination for manufacturing the way China did, and Southeast Asia and everything else, which is the most successful development model on the planet in the last generation. Lots of light manufacturing, employ lots of labor, export to the world. it takes more than just cheap labor, and actually Africa doesn't even have the cheapest labor, even though it's the poorest continent. Places like Bangladesh and parts of India, you actually even have cheaper labor, even though they're not as poor countries. But it also takes infrastructure and communications technology that are pretty good, which most of these countries are lacking, although South Africa is much better shape than others on that. Closeness to markets helps. Right, I mean, China didn't start in China, it started in Japan, right? When I was a little kid, made in Japan was an epithet for cheap junk. Some of you remember that. That was a long time ago, right? I was in Japan last summer. Man, talk about impressive trains, it was pretty stunning. So it's, with Japan, then Taiwan and North Korea, and then China, and then Southeast Asia. Eastern Europe is right next to the EU and has had lots of activity. Africa is a long way from the nearest markets. It doesn't have the human capital in terms of educated, healthy workforce. Communists didn't do a lot of things well, but one thing they did well is create a healthy and educated workforce in China. So there's a lot of ways in which it's not there yet. And the question is, that's this kind of $64 million question. Can it get there, and how long will it take? And of course, someone has to buy all this stuff, which, I mean, Chinese are starting to do, right? They make a transition from just exporting it all to us to buying it themselves, and that's what China's in the process of right now. And as they buy more and more, they're going to have to look for other places. The cheapest labor manufacturing stuff is leaving China now and going elsewhere in Southeast Asia.
Steve, I was wondering, the situation with the De Beers brothers, have they relinquished any part of the mining to the government?
Not that I know of. I don't think so. As far as I know, especially around diamonds, I don't think anything's changed. I honestly don't know for sure, but not that I've ever heard about.
And the second question is, I might have been in the kitchen cleaning. Have you spoken about Soweto? Because when I was there 20 years ago, Soweto was really down, so I don't know.
I didn't say anything about it, and I was there 10 years ago, so that's it's still a while back. And, I mean, from what I've read elsewhere, it varies. There are parts of Soweto have become very middle class.
Yes.
And kind of chic places to live, and I saw some of that, and I saw some of the places that haven't become that at all and are still very poor.
When I was there was some improvement with Soweto, but I don't know the situation right now. Has it gone down, or has it maintained that status?
I would guess it's based just on general economic trends, and from what I've read, I think it's probably maintained the status or improved certainly somewhat. I mean, it's really the second big, we think of it as a township. If you don't know, it's a famous township out outside Johannesburg, the biggest city. It's actually the second biggest city in the country. Soweto on its own, it's huge. It's like 2 million people or something. I believe it's bigger than Cape Town. I'm not sure about that, but it's about the same size. So it's really a city in and of itself. And and areas are, areas are very middle class now. Some areas and some areas aren't.
Right,
So there's been this
noticed.
growing inequality within, as I understand, but I can't tell you much more about it yet. Other questions?
There was something this week on the, or maybe it was last week on the BBC, they were talking about one of these politicians, an ANC politician, talking about appropriating South African white farms, and
Might have been Ramaphosa. He did make a statement about that. That may be what you read. Yeah. Right.
I mean, there's been, there was the reconciliation side of it that seemed positive, and the the rugby team winning the World Cup. All those great things that were happening, and then I think a lot of white South Africans, they keep waiting for that other shoe to drop. There's a very dark joke about what's the difference between South Africa and Zimbabwe, and they say about 10 years. Would that happen? Do you think that would happen?
I find it hard to believe. I mean, Ramaphosa did say this. I mean, I think from what I read, at least in the Kenyan press, he was saying expropriation of unused lands or expropriation of land over a particular very large size. I forget the numbers, but it was a number of You know, if you got more than, I don't know what, say 5,000 acres, maybe that wasn't, maybe it was 2,000. It was a pretty big piece of property.
Right.
But he did say expropriation, not just buyout. So that could lead to some real tension and frictions a la Zimbabwe. I mean, Kenya was the same. The reason Kenya didn't become Zimbabwe is they negotiated a thing in independence. It had the same situation. And they got the World Bank to finance a buyout of the British settlers who owned the land. And that's why it didn't become Zimbabwe, in effect. And Zimbabwe didn't deal with, you know, had the Civil War, that ended. And then Mugabe didn't deal with it until they let the floodgates loose, let just people invade, and it was horrific, and, you know, that's not good either. So the question is how you make that reform. I mean, the reform is important because rural poor South Africans, I mean, the land was stolen. I mean, of course, we're standing on stolen land here, too. But the land there was stolen, and a lot more recently, you know, people, you know, 3 or 4 generations ago, the land was taken, pure and simple. And people feel that, so you want to overcome that, but you could cause a tremendous amount of economic instability if you just expropriate
I
at
think
large
like
scale.
the Huguenots and chasing the Jews
Right,
out of
yeah.
Germany and stuff, it would be.
Similar kind of, yeah, right, yeah. I mean, the ideal is to find some way to buy people out, but like that's what happened in Kenya in 1963, but that's expensive to figure out how to do that. But yeah, I mean, it was Ramaphosa, I imagine. I mean, he made a statement to that effect. Yeah, so we'll see where that goes. I don't know. I mean, he's a huge landowner himself. I mean, I find it hard to believe he's really going to go down that road, but we'll see. Yeah. Happy to talk to people individually.
Oh, this has been fascinating. Having been in South Africa myself, I think of all the things I saw. And one of the things was the wineries.
Oh,
You know, again, it's big land, but if people give it to the African